If you try to read any primary philosophical text, you'll find that no text stands alone. The authors often assume a huge amount of prerequisite reading and familiarity with other texts, from Plato to Aristotle to the Bible and beyond. To the budding philosopher, this bewildering lack of context often makes work confusing and difficult to follow. The task of reading this huge corpus of historical work seems totally overwhelming. How then are we to begin our study of philosophy? A history of philosophy can act as a broad survey of the development of philosophical ideas. It introduces the major themes, arguments, and history of the various thinkers and provides the necessary background to make primary material more approachable. However, there is of course many authors who have attempted this project, and they all have their own advantages and disadvantages. And that's what we're going to explore today. What were the most useful resources in your own philosophical learning journey? I would love to hear about those, so let me know down in the comments below. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice, a YouTube channel all about how to read books and put them to use. Today, I'm going to discuss some of the major histories of philosophy that have been published, what the pros and cons of reading them are, and how best to approach them. Before we begin, I just want to take a minute to discuss in general how you might go about reading a history of philosophy. For the most part, these are unsurprisingly mammoth reads, and if you've never read any history of philosophy, I highly recommend that you should read at least one cover to cover. If you're more familiar with philosophy, then reading more than one from cover to cover is an interesting but very time-consuming exercise. And there's still value in having multiple histories and reading the particular chapter that you're interested in from several different histories. A history can never be free from its author's own interpretation, and so each history gives its own take on the same issue. In my philosophy learning plan, I recommended A Little History of Philosophy by Nigel Warburton because it is a short, funny, and insightful introduction to the history of the topic without needing a huge commitment. While not at all scholarly and shouldn't be considered the only history you should read, it does manage to cram in quite a bit of detail in its 40 short and witty chapters. I think that everyone, more advanced philosophers included, should read this book over a nice, relaxing Sunday afternoon. An easier, more enjoyable history of philosophy, there is none. If you aren't sure about philosophy as a topic worth your time, then Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder might be the perfect thing to introduce you. This is a totally unique take on the idea of a history of philosophy, blending it into a charming novel. This huge bestseller was completely unknown to me, and I find it rarely mentioned in philosophical circles. It is, of course, hardly academic, and in the same vein as A Little History of Philosophy, consider it a starter course to more serious study. But I think that it's often not recommended as an introduction because of its teenage target audience. That can be an advantage. Its easy reading is easily hoovered up, and it's a great introduction to the topic that won't take you that long. The currently in progress series of books developed by Peter Adamson really is a history of philosophy without any gaps. Most histories, including the ones recommended here, have a heavy emphasis on the Western thought tradition, leaving out some really incredible thinkers from the Islamic and Eastern traditions. This history is aimed at a somewhat less academic audience, though is still detailed and expertly researched. It isn't finished, and at the time of publishing, this video is up to Volume 5, Classical Indian Philosophy. Though not as difficult technically to read as other histories on this list, Addison achieves exactly what he sets out to, very few gaps. This can make it overwhelming to the fresh beginner, and it has a somewhat plodding pace at times. This book series is unique in that it started as a podcast of the same name, with hundreds of episodes going much further than the books that have been currently written. This is another great way to familiarise yourself with the history of philosophy if you aren't the strongest reader. It wouldn't be possible to compile a list of histories without discussing a history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell, probably now what might be his most well-known work. The History of Western Philosophy was an instant classic. This is Russell with his typical clinical and analytical style, simply written with always impressive clarity. Russell is the most eminent British philosopher of his time, and his approach to philosophy continues to define a way and style of doing philosophy today. His history is unapologetically influenced by his own views, and he isn't afraid to discard what he doesn't find personally interesting. It's with this criticism in mind that this book is often described as what Russell thinks about Western philosophy. As a purely academic history, the project might have failed, but as an analysis of Western philosophy as its whole, you can turn to worse sources for that. Do I think that you should read it? Of course I do. It's simply too iconic not to. However, it probably shouldn't be the only history that you read, and maybe you'll get more out of this if you know more about philosophy, so you can decide what you think about what Russell thinks. Approach this work with the inquisitive trepidation that embodies philosophy, and not as an authoritative take on the history of the topic. A New History of Western Philosophy by Anthony Kenny is, by all accounts, a more up-to-date, less controversial, and more detailed evolution of Russell's work, rather than, like many histories, structuring the book in a direct chronological order. Kenny starts each section with a few chapters of the history and then breaks down that period into chapters on its major questions and themes. For the serious student of philosophy, there simply is no better book. Its unique structure, excellent writing, and detailed treatment has no substitute. In particular, the fact that it focuses on the themes as they run through history rather than just the history itself means that you'll walk away with a lot more philosophy than just the history alone. Kenny's project is more ambitious than most histories and might just be an excellent way to study philosophy, full stop. Of all the histories on this list, Kenny's project is probably the most worthy of the serious student, and I highly recommend it. There are a huge number of histories out there that I haven't read. Here are some honourable mentions of ones that are held in high regard that I can't personally attest to. The Copleston History of Philosophy has been a mainstay in philosophical education since publication, and it charts a detailed history across 11 volumes. I'm massively interested in reading this. It's just a huge undertaking. There is a condensed version out there, but again, I couldn't attest to its quality. Hegel has his own set of lectures on the history of philosophy, and those are freely available on Gutenberg. Of course, Hegel has his own strong views, so you might read this more in the style of reading Russell's history rather than a general overview. And also sitting on my shelf is The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. This is a much less foreboding project than his huge Story of Civilization, though at almost 900 pages, still quite the undertaking. I'm looking forward to reading this one soon. Hopefully this discussion of the different histories of Western philosophy have given you some ideas to where and what you should read next. But what are the most useful resources that you've used in your philosophical learning journey? What are your favourite primary texts? And what do you think beginners should read? Let me know down in the comment section below. If you like philosophy, reading and self-study, then you'll also like my Substack. Links to my Substack and all the books mentioned here are in the description box. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.